China promises African nations $50 billion in loans and funding at a summit of leaders in Beijing. It underlines the country's position as the continent's #1 investor. What does this investment mean for Africa, China and its Western rivals? Abroad usually mean expenditure for most of us, but African leaders will be coming home from a summit in Beijing with pledges of more than $50 billion in loans and funding from their Chinese hosts.
For many Africans, their perception of China has changed because they can see the tangible results of China entering the continent. 100,000 kilometers of road, 10,000 kilometers of railway, over 1,000 bridges, 100 ports, and scores of hospitals and schools. These are the type of projects that give hope to future generations and provide pathways for living a better quality of life. Instead of making similar infrastructure investments in Africa, the US government's primary objective is lecturing African leaders on the dangers of working with China, in hopes that the US can somehow reverse the trend of
Africa's bilateral trade with China surged to a record high last year. According to China's General Customs Office, the country's new direct investment in Africa stood at $3.4 billion last year. Now, bilateral trade between China and Africa stood at $282 billion last year, representing a percentage growth rate of 11.2%.
Dynamics changing in favor of especially the African exports to China because U.S. policy has pushed African partners further toward China with their tariffs.
So, absolutely. The main point is the uncertainty around Trump policy making has meant it's very difficult for people to make medium-term business decisions about the export market into the U.S. And I think that the certainty
Trade between Africa and China is shooting up by 19% every year, according to official figures released Thursday by Chinese leaders. In the first half of 2017, they totaled more than $85.3 billion in value. Chinese imports from the African continent almost doubled by an estimated 46% compared to the same period a year ago, reaching around $38.4 billion.
Imagine waking up one morning in Washington and realizing the unthinkable has happened overnight. China, the world's second-largest economy, has officially cut off nearly $500 billion in trade from the United States and rerouted it straight to Africa. Not next year, not gradually, overnight. And suddenly, the U.S. finds itself standing outside the very global supply chain it once controlled, because Beijing didn't just shift a few contracts. It redirected entire industries, manufacturing, shipping, electronics, agriculture, minerals into African economies that Western analysts once dismissed as too risky. But now, those same African nations are becoming the center of the new global economy, and the West is scrambling to understand how everything changed so fast. And here's the part that has Washington panicking the most. For the first time in modern history, Africa isn't responding from a position of weakness. It isn't begging for aid. It isn't negotiating from desperation. Africa is negotiating from power because China's 500B shift instantly created the largest trade realignment of the century, and the United States suddenly has no leverage. Factories that once operated in California, Texas, and Ohio are being rebuilt in Kenya, Ethiopia, Zambia, and Egypt. Container ships that once docked in U.S. harbors are now being rerouted to African ports expanded by Chinese engineering, and global corporations that once depended on U.S. regulations are signing deals with African governments that finally demand value addition, technology transfer, and job guarantees. But the biggest shock? Africa is accepting nothing less than equal partnership and China is agreeing. Meanwhile, U.S. farmers, tech companies, and manufacturers are waking up to collapsing orders, empty contracts, and rising costs. Economists call it the largest trade shock in American history. Politicians call it a national crisis, but Africa calls it something else, a long overdue correction of global power. Because this isn't just about economics, this is about history. This is about ending a world where Africa supplied raw materials and the West controlled the profits. This is about a continent rewriting its place in global trade on its own terms, with its own partners. And now, as Africa and China grow closer, the U.S. faces a brutal reality. The global economy is moving without it. Trade routes are shifting without it, and for the first time ever, Africa is choosing its partners, and the West has no power to stop it. This is the moment Washington feared. This is the moment Africa has been waiting for. And this is the story of how China's $500 billion shift didn't just change trade. It changed the world.
All right, the China-South Africa Economy and Trade Association is holding a job fair in Johannesburg to showcase Chinese enterprises offering job opportunities to South Africans. About 100 enterprises are attending the fair with the hope to offer 1,000 jobs to local applicants. More than 100 well-known Chinese companies based in South Africa are offering nearly 20,000 jobs over the next 3 years. SABC News.
History is being written in real time. And it's not by Donald Trump. It's by South Africa, standing tall in the face of economic blackmail. What started as Trump's petty retaliation for South Africa's independent choices has now sparked a global realignment. After South Africa supported Palestinian human rights, deepened ties with China and Russia, and finally began confronting its painful colonial past through long overdue land reform, the Trump administration decided to punish the country.
China's decision to shift nearly $500 billion worth of trade from the United States to Africa did not happen overnight by accident. It was a long brewing storm, the kind that begins as a whisper in faraway capitals and ends as a thunderclap shaking the world economy. For decades, Beijing watched the shifting tides of global power, measuring every move with quiet precision. The United States had grown used to being the unquestioned hub of China's export machine, the primary destination for its manufactured goods, electronics, steel, machinery, and consumer products. But beneath the surface, the relationship was creaking, weighed down by political tensions, sanctions, tariffs, and a rising sense in Beijing that the era of economic dependency on Washington had reached its expiration date. Africa, meanwhile, stood at the edge of its own transformation. From Nairobi to Lagos, from Addis Ababa to Johannesburg, a new economic rhythm had begun to pulse: bigger markets, younger populations, expanding industrial zones, rising technology hubs, and a hunger for partnerships built on respect rather than interference. African nations had grown weary of old colonial systems in new clothing, the sort of global arrangement where they exported raw materials and imported poverty. They were seeking allies who valued cooperation over control. China knew this. China studied this. And ultimately, China acted on this. The shift began quietly. Chinese delegations visited African capitals not with demands but with proposals: massive infrastructure support, joint manufacturing zones, billion-dollar credit lines, new ports, alternative payment systems, and guarantees that African nations would be treated as equal partners in the new world economy. While the United States debated sanctions, China built railways. While Washington delivered speeches about influence, Beijing delivered factories, fiber optic cables, and industrial parks. Slowly, African leaders realized that the old pattern, exporting minerals to Europe and America only to buy back finished products at inflated prices, was a trap. A fresh route was opening, and it led east. The final break came when numerous African countries announced an unprecedented collective trade initiative, a continental framework for processing raw materials domestically, manufacturing goods locally, and partnering with countries willing to support this vision. China, sensing both an opportunity and a geopolitical shift, immediately redirected hundreds of billions in trade and investment toward Africa. The United States was caught off guard. For years it had operated under the illusion that China would always rely on the American market, that the two economies were permanently entangled. But China had been preparing its exit strategy, diversifying supply chains, expanding global partnerships, and turning Africa into the centerpiece of its emerging trade empire. African nations welcomed the shift with overwhelming enthusiasm. For the first time in modern economic history, they were not merely suppliers but co-architects of global trade routes. Chinese manufacturers set up advanced production centers in Kenya, Egypt, Tunisia, South Africa, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Ghana, and Tanzania. These centers did more than churn out cheap products. They produced electronics, electric vehicle components, green energy equipment, agricultural machinery, medical devices, and processed foods that were now being exported worldwide. African ports, once controlled by European conglomerates, were modernized with Chinese technology. African currencies were increasingly used in bilateral transactions, and the grip of the dollar was loosening. What unsettled Washington most was the speed. Within months, the trade redirection was visible. Chinese ships that once docked in Los Angeles and New York were now heading to Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, Cotonou, Maputo, and Abidjan. Goods that had been a lifeline for American retailers and markets were now flowing through African trade corridors. Even more threatening was the fact that many of these products were cheaper due to Africa's growing industrial efficiency, and the continent was positioning itself as a rival export powerhouse rather than just a resource supplier. The United States tried to counter the shift with diplomatic pressure, but the world had changed. African leaders publicly stated that they would no longer be bullied into choosing sides. They emphasized that this new partnership was built on opportunity, fairness, and mutual benefit, something they had not experienced under Western systems that extracted wealth without building prosperity. The real shock came when Africa and China jointly announced a massive trade settlement system that bypassed Western financial institutions entirely. It was a digital, multi-currency platform designed to avoid the sanctions and political manipulation that African nations had long suffered under. Overnight, this system allowed dozens of countries to trade freely without needing clearance from Western banks. It was a quiet revolution, but a revolution nonetheless, one that shattered decades of financial control. For ordinary Africans, the impact was immediate. Factories opened, unemployment dropped, locally made products filled the markets. Roads, ports, and energy grids expanded at a pace unseen in modern Africa. The continent began capturing value from its own resources for the first time since colonial borders were drawn on its soil. For China, the benefit was equally profound: a vast new consumer base, reliable trade corridors, and a geopolitical ally that understood the history of global exploitation. But for the United States, the shift was devastating. Imports from China slowed, prices increased, supply chains became unstable, and American businesses lost access to critical goods. Washington had not anticipated this because it had not taken African power seriously. It had assumed Africa would always remain under European influence, always be the passive participant in global trade. That illusion shattered the moment China and Africa aligned their strategies. This was not simply a trade shift, it was a rewriting of global power. It was a continent reclaiming its economic destiny and an Asian giant repositioning its global alliances. The world witnessed the birth of a new axis of prosperity, one that bypassed the old colonial roots entirely. The economic winds were no longer blowing from Washington or Brussels, they were blowing across the Sahara, through the Savannah, and across the Indian Ocean. And for the first time in modern history, Africa was not being shaped by global power, it was shaping it. The consequences of China's 500B trade shift toward Africa rippled across the globe with a force no one in the West had predicted. The United States tried to downplay the situation, calling it temporary, unserious, or strategic posturing, but the reality was unmistakable. The world's most powerful economy had been bypassed, and a new global supply chain was forming that did not revolve around Washington. Europe felt the shock next. Factories in Germany, France, and Italy, long accustomed to a steady stream of Chinese imports and African raw materials, suddenly found themselves squeezed. China's exports were rerouting. Africa's minerals were no longer flowing north. A continent Europe once exploited for centuries was now turning its back on old colonial markets. In favor of its own industrial growth, African nations embraced the moment with a level of unity that stunned Western analysts. Diplomats from Senegal to Zambia openly declared that the era of extraction without development was finished. Instead of exporting raw bauxite, they were producing aluminum sheets. Instead of shipping unprocessed cocoa, they were manufacturing chocolate. Instead of sending crude oil abroad, they were refining it at home. The continent that had once been the backbone of European wealth was now redirecting its energy toward its own prosperity, and China was providing the machinery, technology, and logistical support to accelerate the transformation. This new Africa-China alliance grew stronger with each passing month. The trade redirection had unlocked a burst of manufacturing energy across the continent. Ethiopia became a hub for textiles and electronics. Kenya's special economic zones churned out industrial equipment and consumer goods. Rwanda grew into a tech assembly center. Ghana processed gold and built electric vehicle parts. South Africa expanded its advanced automotive production. Nigeria invested in large-scale refineries, fertilizers, and petrochemicals. With China's guidance, these industries were no longer dreams on paper, they were engines of real, measurable power. To ensure the partnership was balanced, African governments insisted on joint ownership of factories, technology transfers, and local skilled labor programs. China agreed, eager to prove it could work differently from Western powers. Chinese companies brought engineers, but African universities trained thousands of new graduates to run the facilities. Joint research centers emerged across the continent, developing innovations tailored to Africa's climate, soil, industries, and markets. Solar power grids in Namibia, irrigation drones in Sudan, AI-backed port logistics in Morocco, these were not charity projects. They were strategic investments shaping Africa's future. The most dramatic shift came in the agricultural sector. With China's trade redirection, African farmers suddenly gained access to massive export markets. Tanzania, Malawi, Cameroon, and Mozambique expanded their rice, tea, fruit, and vegetable exports through China's new African shipping lanes. Cold storage hubs powered by Chinese-built solar plants reduced spoilage by over 50%, turning subsistence farmers into global competitors. New processing plants allowed African countries to export packaged foods instead of raw produce, a leap that had taken European nations over a century to achieve. Western corporations began to panic. Their control over African land, food chains, and import markets was weakening quickly. For decades, they sold processed foods back to Africa at inflated prices. But now Africa was producing its own. Chinese-built supermarkets popped up across urban centers, stocked with African-made goods. Local brands flourished. Western brands started vanishing from shelves. What shocked Western analysts most was not the economic shift, but the psychological one. African consumers no longer viewed Western products as superior. The entire narrative of dependency was collapsing. This shift extended to finance. The Africa-China digital settlement system grew rapidly, bypassing Western intermediaries. African central banks integrated it into national frameworks. Trade was now being settled in local African currencies and China's currency, reducing reliance on the dollar. For the first time in modern economic history, Africa was participating in global trade without begging for Western approval. The dollar's dominance had long been a tool of control, used to restrict transactions, block development, or punish governments that dared to act independently. But this new system was immune to such tactics. Western think tanks called it a financial rebellion. African leaders called it independence. The rerouting of trade also reduced shipping times and costs significantly. Chinese freight ships now traveled directly to African ports, avoiding long transatlantic routes. African logistics firms partnered with Chinese shipping giants to build efficient maritime corridors around the Indian Ocean and Atlantic Rim. Ports in Kenya, Djibouti, Angola, and Senegal became major global nodes. Africa, once seen as a peripheral zone of global trade, was becoming the transit heart of a new economic order linking Asia, the Middle East, and South America. The West tried to respond, but it was too slow and too divided. Europe attempted to revive old ties with Africa, offering aid packages and partnerships. But Africans had heard these promises before. Many countries rejected offers outright, stating that they were tired of deals that kept them dependent. Others politely accepted discussions but demanded terms Europe could not meet: equal ownership, local manufacturing, and the end of exploitative trade systems. Europe balked and Africa walked away. The United States took a harsher approach. It issued warnings, sanctions, and allegations. It accused China of economic colonization, ignoring its own centuries-long role in shaping Africa's underdevelopment. It called African governments reckless for embracing new trade routes, but African officials responded with a unified voice. They would not return to a world where their resources enriched others while their people remained poor. This defiance shocked Washington. The United States had underestimated how deeply African nations remembered their history: the centuries of extraction, the imposed debts, the coups supported by foreign powers, the trade rules designed to keep Africa underdeveloped. This collective memory had now transformed into collective action as China and Africa deepened their partnership. The benefits became too large to reverse. African nations gained technology, infrastructure, markets, and bargaining power. China gained a stable trade partner outside the influence of Western tensions. The United States, meanwhile, found itself facing empty shipping docks, unstable supply chains, and rising import costs. American analysts concluded that rebuilding lost trade routes would take decades if it was even possible, and through it all, Africa's confidence soared. For the first time in generations, the continent was not reacting to global events, it was creating them. Africa's rise was no longer a prophecy or a slogan. It was happening in real time, powered by strategic decisions, bold alliances, and the refusal to be controlled by old empire systems. The world was witnessing a historic pivot, one that proved a simple truth. When Africa chooses its own path, the global order changes not slowly, but thunderously. The shift of China's $500 billion trade toward Africa had started as an economic strategy, but by the time it reached full momentum, it had become something far bigger: a geopolitical earthquake. Every major power was forced to reassess the world map because the new center of global gravity was no longer in the north, it was moving decisively toward the south. African nations felt this change most strongly. Their influence in global institutions surged. Their votes in international forums suddenly mattered. Their participation in trade negotiations carried real weight. Countries that had once been treated as background players were now essential partners in discussions about food security. minerals, climate, shipping routes, digital finance, and manufacturing. The West struggled to adapt to this new reality. For generations, Europe and the United States had shaped global trade rules to favor their corporations, their banks, and their interests. They controlled the flow of capital. They controlled shipping. They controlled narratives. Africa, fragmented and under pressure, struggled to challenge the system. But now the tables had turned. African leaders entered global summits not as recipients of aid, but as architects of a new order backed by the world's second-largest economy. The key to Africa's rising influence was its newfound unity. The trade shift had forced African nations to coordinate policies, share intelligence, harmonize customs regulations, and build regional supply chains. Customs modernization in West Africa reduced border delays from weeks to days. East Africa created unified export corridors that shortened shipping time to Asia by almost half. Southern Africa integrated rail networks so minerals, machinery, and agricultural goods could move seamlessly across borders. This level of coordination was something the West had never expected, and it fundamentally altered Africa's global position. China, for its part, was not simply shifting trade, it was relocating industries. Factories that once operated in coastal Chinese cities were being transplanted into industrial parks in Zambia, Ethiopia, Botswana, and Egypt. These plants brought value-added production into Africa, giving the continent a long-denied foothold in global manufacturing. African workers acquired new skills. African companies gained access to technology. African cities developed into industrial clusters capable of supplying goods not just to China, but to markets around the world. This industrial transformation made Africa a central node in China's long-term economic strategy. China needed partners who were not entangled in Western geopolitical rivalries, sanctions, and ideological battles. Africa offered that. In return, China opened its consumer market to African exporters, allowing products that once struggled to escape local markets to reach hundreds of millions of new buyers. African-made shoes, electronics, textiles, teas, coffees, chocolates, fruits, metal parts, and automotive components flooded Chinese stores. The West suddenly found itself competing with Africa for market share in a country of 1.4 billion people. This was unthinkable a decade earlier. The deeper the Africa-China partnership became, the more Western influence weakened. Europe was the first to feel the pressure. Its industries relied heavily on African minerals and Chinese manufacturing. Now Africa was processing more of its own minerals, and China was supplying fewer goods to Europe. This double blow triggered a supply crunch that forced European companies to auction contracts, raise prices, and scramble for alternatives. For the first time in its modern history, Europe faced what African nations had endured for generations: economic vulnerability. The United States, however, suffered the greatest geopolitical shock. For years, Washington assumed that Africa's strategic loyalty was assured due to military partnerships, development aid, and diplomatic presence. But economic gravity proved stronger than political promises. As African nations reoriented their trade toward China, they also strengthened ties with the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and South America. New trade corridors bypassed traditional Atlantic routes, reducing the relevance of U.S. ports and shipping lanes. As African countries gained prosperity, they began rejecting U.S.-led negotiations that did not align with their economic ambitions. Washington's influence was fading not because Africa was rebelling, but because Africa no longer needed the United States to achieve prosperity. This shift became evident when African countries collectively announced new conditions for foreign investment: local processing of raw materials, joint ownership of industries, technology transfer into African institutions, regional hiring quotas. Export rights that favored African markets first. China accepted these conditions. Western corporations refused. That refusal cost them access to the fastest-growing economic zone in the world. As African economies expanded, so did their political confidence. They demanded reforms in global financial institutions, greater voting power in international bodies, and a restructuring of development finance that had historically kept them indebted. China supported these demands, understanding that a stronger Africa meant a stronger multipolar world that could counterbalance Western dominance. Together, Africa and China began pushing for new global systems: banking, shipping, trade settlement, and technology standards designed to give developing nations more control over their economic futures. One of the most transformative changes came in the digital economy. China helped African countries build payment systems, data centers, undersea cables, and cloud infrastructure. These systems operated independently of Western-owned networks. African startups began launching platforms that rivaled Western digital giants in local markets, from from logistics apps to fintech systems to AI-driven agricultural support tools. With digital independence came narrative independence. African media outlets gained stronger digital distribution channels, reducing Western control over information flow. Meanwhile, in American newsrooms, the narrative began to shift from confidence to fear. Analysts warned that the U.S. economy could face long-term structural challenges if it could not secure access to Africa's rapidly expanding markets. The loss of trade opportunities, weakening supply chains, and rising competition from African-made goods created an economic pressure Washington was not prepared for. Politicians demanded aggressive countermeasures, sanctions, incentives, diplomatic pressure, but none of these approaches worked. Africa was no longer in a position where threats mattered. This new reality became even more visible when African countries announced plans to create one of the largest industrial free trade belts in the world. With China as a strategic partner, the belt aimed to link mineral processing in the south, food production in the north, tech manufacturing in the east, automotive production in the west, and energy development across the center. For the first time in modern history, Africa was building a complete economic ecosystem capable of producing raw materials, finished products, and advanced technologies all within its own borders. Washington realized too late that its old strategy of ignoring African industrialization had backfired. The U.S. had invested heavily in regions it considered strategically important, but it had overlooked the continent that held the key to future minerals, population growth, food production, and shipping lanes. China had seen this future early. The United States had seen Africa only through the lens of aid, charity, and crisis. Now Africa was demonstrating that it was not a victim of global events, it was a driver of global transformation. The global order was no longer centered on a single power or a single continent, it was shifting toward multiple centers of strength, and Africa was one of them. China's 500B trade shift had accelerated a movement that had been building for decades, the rise of Africa as a decisive force in world affairs. The West could not reverse this momentum. The age of unilateral dominance had ended. A new world was emerging, one built through partnership, not exploitation, and Africa stood at the heart of it.